Today, we will look into the events that took place in Williamsport, Pennsylvania in 1999. Imagine, a quiet evening, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But on that night, Miriam Illes' life was suddenly cut short. Today, we will dive into a case that still sparks much controversy. You will hear not just a crime story, you'll face a puzzle where every detail contradicted another. A locked house, no signs of forced entry. A dark secret with many suspects, no witnesses, several DNA samples, and an alibi for the main suspect. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. You'll learn how an old photograph could turn the entire investigation upside down. It all started on January 17, 1999, when a man called 911 and reported that a woman had been found in a house. He was a friend of the victim and had gone to check on her because she hadn't been answering her phone calls. When he arrived at her house, he found that it was locked. None of the doors would open. He looked through the window and saw his friend, Miriam Illes, lying on the kitchen floor. It was clear that she was dead. When the police arrived at the scene and entered the house to inspect the body, they saw that Miriam had been shot in the back, in the heart area. Investigators interviewed the man who called 911, and he provided them with enough information about the victim. Miriam was a homemaker, formerly a medical worker. She was involved in the local community. That day, her friends were worried because she didn't show up for Sunday school class. She was a good person and a very dedicated mother to a young boy. Many people knew her, and everyone who did thought she had no enemies. Yet, the woman who had no enemies was found on the floor of her own kitchen, and all the doors in the house were locked. What had happened to Miriam was a mystery that investigators needed to solve. They had to determine the time of death. Since there were no witnesses, the exact time of death remained unclear. The police officers examined the crime scene in search of evidence. The house was undisturbed, and there were no signs of forced entry. All the external doors leading to the house and garage were locked. When the body was discovered, a telephone receiver was lying near Miriam's hand. This indicated that she was likely on the phone with someone when she was shot in the back. It's possible she didn't even see the attacker, and everything that happened was a complete surprise to her. Investigators requested a report from the phone company to learn about Miriam's recent phone calls. While thoroughly inspecting the crime scene and trying to understand how the perpetrator entered and left the house, the detectives noticed something important. They saw a bullet hole in the window. It was an exterior double-glazed window located right above the kitchen sink. It was clear that the person who shot Miriam was outside the house. She likely had been standing, leaning against the kitchen sink, talking on the phone when the fatal shot rang out. This single shot now became the only lead. When investigators traced the trajectory of the shot, it led them to a creek bed behind Miriam's house. Then, as they continued their search, the forensics team was able to find foot impressions. They were left by size 14 Reebok basketball shoes. The tracks were positioned in such a way that it was clear someone had taken a shooting position next to a tree right behind Miriam's kitchen window. The detectives also found a cigarette butt at the location from where the shot was fired. During further searches, they discovered what turned out to be a homemade silencer. It was becoming obvious to investigators that the crime had been planned in advance. The perpetrator had been hiding behind the tree, waiting for the right moment. He paced back and forth, smoked a cigarette, and knew exactly what he was doing. But who did this, and why? Someone had taken serious steps and put a lot of effort into planning and carrying out this crime. It didn't seem like Miriam was involved in any illegal activities or taking any risky actions that would put her in danger. Investigators were looking to gather more information from Dr. Richard Illes, who showed up when the investigators were at the crime scene. Dr. Richard Illes was a cardiothoracic surgeon at Williamsport Hospital. He was well known and had saved many lives. In the early 90s, Illes met Miriam Zambi while working as a resident at St. Louis Medical Center. Miriam was a surgical assistant. Within a few years after they married, they had a son, Richie, and moved to Williamsport, where the Illes worked side by side together. Miriam was active in her community as well, volunteering at the symphony and at church. She was a dynamic, exuberant personality who made friends wherever she went. Despite the money and the status, Miriam's friends say she was very down to earth. They were one of the wealthiest people in Williamsport, if not the wealthiest. Miriam decided to become a stay-at-home mom when Richie was 2. She quit her job and never looked back. When a woman is murdered in her own home, the first person to focus on is her husband. Dr. Illes told investigators that the last time he saw Miriam was when he visited her home 2 days earlier on Friday, around 5 p.m. He was planning to visit his family, who lived in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Then the detectives learned that the couple had recently separated after 8 years of marriage. Miriam had moved out of their family home into the house where she was found dead. Miriam had primary custody of their son, Richie, and Richard Illes visited him every weekend. The fact that they were going through a divorce became a potential motive. Investigators had to carefully examine their relationship. Dr. Illes' behavior immediately struck the detectives as odd because the first thing he asked when he was told that Miriam was dead was what evidence had been found. At that moment, it seemed like a rather strange question for someone who had just learned that the woman he had been married to for 8 years, the woman with whom he shared a child, was now dead. Then, Richard Illes made an interesting confession. He told the detectives that he was no stranger to handling firearms. He had been involved in hunting and owned firearms, which was common for many people in the area. There was nothing particularly unusual about that. Investigators wanted to take a look at Richard's weapons and see if any were linked to the crime scene. They were able to determine that the bullet that killed Miriam was a .22 caliber, which gave the police an idea of what type of weapon they should be looking for. Dr. Illes owned several .22 caliber rifles, which the police seized for examination. Richard became the main suspect in the case as he had a motive, access to weapons, and the necessary skills to carry out the crime. Love can easily turn into hate, and that hate could have been the reason for Miriam's death. While the firearms seized from Richard Illes were being analyzed in the forensics lab, investigators dug deeper into his life. As a cardiothoracic surgeon, he earned a good salary. He was paying a substantial amount for child support, around $12,000 a month. Money could have been another reason why Richard might have wanted his wife dead. Investigators demanded details from Dr. Illes about his whereabouts when Miriam was shot. Richard was supposed to pick up Richie for the weekend on Friday evening. He decided to spend the weekend with his sister, who lived 2.5 hours away in Honeybrook, Pennsylvania. He could confirm the beginning of his trip with the help of a witness, Nancy Mitch. Nancy Mitch was able to explain to investigators that she was with Miriam during the exchange when Miriam handed over her son Richie to Dr. Richard Illes for the weekend. Richard picked up Richie around 5 p.m. Nancy left, and Miriam seemed to be fine. So the last time they could confirm that Miriam was alive was around 6 p.m. on Friday, January 15th. Now the police knew that Richard had picked up his son from Miriam's house and left. Miriam stayed home, and everything seemed fine with her. Richard told investigators that he made a brief stop before heading to his sister's. First, they stopped at his house. Around 9:30 p.m., he headed towards southeastern Pennsylvania with his son. According to him, they reached Lewisburg and stopped at a fast food restaurant. He indicated that the stop was around 10 p.m. The weather was bad that evening, and he called his sister around 11:24 p.m. to let her know he was going to stop and that he and Richie would spend the night near Harrisburg. Nancy confirmed one part of Richard's alibi. Now, detectives needed to verify if the rest of the information he provided was accurate. They checked Richard's cell phone records and confirmed that he did indeed contact his sister. He also had a receipt from a hotel in the Harrisburg area where he checked in at 12:57 a.m. Richard's story was verified, and it seemed like he couldn't have been at the crime scene when someone shot Miriam. A check of Richard's rifles showed that none of them matched the murder weapon. The silencer found at the crime scene didn't fit any of Richard's rifles either. Additionally, DNA samples found on the silencer and the cigarette butt didn't match Dr. Richard Illes' DNA. As the investigation continued, the police learned that Richard had been having an affair. He had developed a romantic relationship with Catherine Sawyer, a colleague at Williamsport Hospital, which had led to his separation from Miriam. The circumstances under which he met Miriam were very similar. He had started working with her, they formed a relationship, and they got married. Then, the same thing happened with Kathy. She worked with Richard, and they eventually started an affair. This information allowed investigators to propose another theory, a love triangle. Catherine could have had a motive to kill Miriam. She might have wanted to remove Miriam from her path to eliminate the possibility that Dr. Illes would reconcile with his wife. Jealousy is often the driving force behind terrible actions, but there was more at stake than just their relationship. In a divorce, Richard and Miriam would have to divide property and split a lot of money. In addition, Richie would probably stay with his mother, and Richard would have to pay child support. Miriam's death was beneficial to both Dr. Richard Illes and his new lover, Catherine. Detectives needed to figure out where Catherine was when Miriam was killed. If Richard had left town to visit his family, it would have given Catherine the opportunity to commit the crime. However, investigators discovered that when the crime occurred, Catherine wasn't in town. She was visiting relatives in another state. She couldn't have committed the crime. The problem was that the police had no other suspects. There were only Richard and Catherine, but both of them had alibis. Then, an unexpected turn in the investigation occurred. The perp contacted detectives on his own. Letters were sent to the police station. The first anonymous letter claimed that the letter writer was responsible for the murder of Miriam Illes. The detectives were baffled. They had never encountered anything like this before. At first, they assumed that someone thought it would be funny to send such a letter to the police. Perhaps some teenagers were amusing themselves. Maybe someone had seen the case in the news and sent the letters to the police but had no connection to the case. The person who wrote the letter claimed to be a soldier of God, a soldier of death. He claimed that the victim was a bad person, that she was immoral. It didn't make any sense, and it was just strange. Although the criminal tried to make contact, he also went to great lengths to conceal his identity. The letters were checked for fingerprints. There were none. They were written by hand, in block letters, with a pencil. It was done in such a way that the police couldn't compare the handwriting and determine how this person usually wrote. While the investigators were puzzled over the letter and its contents, another letter arrived. The second letter was written in a different style, and the author clearly displayed arrogance and intellectual superiority. The second letter led investigators to a new suspect. The author described himself as someone with academic degrees, many of them. This suggested that the crime might have been committed by one of Richard Illes' colleagues. The most likely person, according to investigators, was Dr. Zama. He was a very good friend of Miriam's. He and Richard were partners. Since Richard Illes headed the cardiology department, this could have caused friction between him and Dr. Zama. Dr. Zama turned out to be a tall man, likely with fairly large feet, possibly size 14. He was certainly someone the investigators needed to focus on regarding the anonymous letters. Dr. Zama was called in for questioning, and investigators showed him both letters. Dr. Zama believed someone was trying to frame him. He claimed to have no connection to Miriam's death and insisted he never wrote the letters. According to him, he got along with Miriam, and they were friends. He also stated that he had been with friends during the time of the crime. Investigators checked Dr. Zama's alibi, and it was confirmed. He could not have been the one who shot Miriam. The anonymous letters were also tested for DNA. A black hair was found on the sealed flap of the envelope. The DNA was tested and did not match Dr. Zama's, but it also didn't match any other DNA samples collected from the crime scene. Investigators now began to think that someone was trying to mislead them, trying to send them down a false path. The person who wrote the letters went to great lengths to conceal his identity, but did he accidentally send his hair to the police? The investigators believed that the letter writer had deliberately put the hair in the envelope because it belonged to someone else unrelated to the case. The police now suspected that they had been planted with false evidence. The silencer with DNA, the cigarette butt with DNA, the letters with DNA, all indicated that someone was trying to confuse them. In the end, investigators had 4 DNA samples, and they all belonged to different people. It turned out that the perpetrator was very cunning and thought that the false evidence would prevent the police from solving the case. Then, investigators received the information they had been waiting for since the first day of the investigation. When Miriam's body was found, there was a phone receiver near her. Investigators obtained phone records and learned that she had been talking on the phone with a friend all evening. Officers met with this woman, and she explained that during her and Miriam's phone conversation, she heard the sound of breaking glass. She heard Miriam say, "Oh my God." After that, she heard nothing and hung up. She called back and got a busy signal. She simply assumed the call had been dropped and that Miriam was talking to someone else. This new information provided detectives with what they had been missing from the very start of the investigation. The call ended at 10:37 p.m. It was the exact time of death. The time of death was crucial. Knowing the exact time of death, detectives began to recheck the alibis of all potential suspects. Dr. Richard Illes' alibi was now less convincing. At first, he said he was in the Williamsport area, and by 10 p.m., he was already heading south on Highway 15. He claimed that he and his son stopped to eat at a restaurant. If he had indeed been at the restaurant around 10 p.m., he couldn't have committed the crime, but detectives couldn't confirm he was there at 10 p.m. Because of this, his alibi was no longer convincing. Investigators refocused on Richard. He drove south on Highway 15, and at 11:24 p.m., he called his sister and told her that he and Richie would have to stay at a hotel. That call became very important. Detectives began to find out where Richard's cell phone was when he called his sister. The new information changed the course of the investigation. The cell phone company provided coverage maps, and the police were able to pinpoint roughly where Richard's phone call had been made. It turned out that Richard had enough time to commit the crime and then get to the hotel where he checked in at 12:57 a.m. Detectives conducted an experiment, driving the same route from the victim's home to the hotel, and confirmed that Dr. Illes could have committed the crime at 10:37 p.m. and still made it to Harrisburg in time to check into the hotel at 12:57 a.m. The distance from the crime scene to the hotel was about 100 miles. Even though the weather had been bad, the investigators made the trip within the time frame. Dr. Richard Illes was now the only suspect without an alibi. But the lack of an alibi didn't make him a criminal. The police needed evidence that would directly link him to the crime. They were fortunate. It was a big break, no doubt. 2 men were walking in the woods and stumbled upon a modified rifle. They thought it looked strange, so they picked it up and called the police. The rifle had a shortened barrel, a stock, and an optical sight. The bolt had been removed and discarded. All markings on the rifle had been filed off to conceal its serial numbers. They determined it was a .22 caliber rifle, which matched the bullet that killed Miriam. The rifle was found near the road Richard Illes was driving on the night of the murder. Using the suppressor found at the crime scene, experts tried to determine if this rifle was the murder weapon. There was a screw on the barrel that had been added so the suppressor could be mounted on it. The suppressor fit perfectly with this rifle. Now the question was how to connect the weapon to Dr. Richard Illes. It was a Savage 23D Hornet rifle. Police learned that Dr. Illes had inherited his father's weapons, and his Aunt Jeanne was the only person who knew about it. A detective met with Richard's aunt and began asking her questions. She pulled out a photo album and flipped through it, showing the detective old pictures. On one black and white photo, she showed him her brother, posing with a Savage 23D rifle. There were too many coincidences pointing to Richard as the perpetrator. He had inherited the rifle from his father, along with other firearms. However, his gun safe contained many weapons, but the Savage rifle was not among them. The investigators still needed more evidence to secure a conviction. There were several DNA samples in the case that did not match Richard Illes' DNA. When the snow melted, investigators returned to the forest where the rifle had been found and conducted a thorough search. They discovered a pair of athletic shoes. It was determined that the shoes were the same size as the footprints at the crime scene. They also had the same tread pattern, meaning the prints had been left by the same shoes. Such a coincidence, with sneakers and a rifle found in the woods matching those used in the crime, was highly improbable. Experts needed to prove that the shoes belonged to Richard Illes. The sneakers were size 14, while Richard wore size 10. It was possible he had purposely worn shoes that were not his size to mislead the police. The shoes were sent to the lab for forensic analysis. A hair was found on the tongue of one of the sneakers. DNA testing showed that it did not match Dr. Illes's. This was another setback for the investigators, but they refused to give up. If they were right, Richard Illes was not the only person at the crime scene that night. They theorized that Richard had given his son Richie sleeping pills to make him fall asleep in the car. Another hair test was conducted, this time searching for a match to Richie's DNA, not Richard's. They found a match based on mitochondria. Richard Illes had planned to use false DNA to mislead the police, but in the end, his son's DNA connected him to the murder. Investigators believed that Richie's hair had ended up in the sneaker by accident, possibly transferred from another surface when Richard had changed his shoes. In December 2002, 3 years after Miriam's death, Richard was arrested, which came as a surprise to him. He was very smart. He made a plan. He created an alibi. He made a silencer. He wore the wrong shoe size. He left DNA on the silencer. He left DNA on the cigarette butt. He sent the police the hair in an envelope, but all the DNA samples belonged to other people. He got rid of the rifle by destroying all the serial numbers. It looks like he was in a hurry to get to the hotel to provide an alibi, so he didn't hide the rifle and boots more carefully or somewhere else where they couldn't be found. Richard Illes had carefully prepared for this crime. He had to modify the rifle and make a suppressor. All of this took time. He didn't want his son to witness the horrible scene, so he planned the crime for the weekend when Richie stayed with him. The plan was put into action on Friday at 5 o'clock in the evening when he picked up his son from Miriam's. Richard returned a few hours later and parked the car about half a mile from Miriam's house. He gave his son a sleeping pill to sleep in the car. Richard then walked along the creek bed and positioned himself by a tree. He waited until Miriam was near the kitchen window. He couldn't shoot from any other position, so he waited for hours until Miriam was in the right place. At 10:37 p.m., she was there, talking on the phone with a friend. That was when he took the shot. He left evidence at the crime scene, a cigarette butt in a place where it could be found. Then he left the scene, leaving size 14 shoe prints, returned to the car, and drove south. He went to a secluded spot to dispose of the evidence. He discarded his rifle and sneakers, then returned to the road and continued on his trail. He then called his sister at 11:24 p.m., knowing that the phone records would help him create an alibi. However, the records actually showed that he had enough time to commit the crime. Richard Illes did not confess to the crime. However, the jury believed otherwise and found him guilty. In 2004, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The victim's family issued a statement saying, "This was a tragic thing here, and we don't feel there are any winners, but we are glad to finally get to this point, to have a resolution and justice." Richard Illes attempted to appeal the court's decision, but he was unsuccessful.